Welcome back to the Mature Male Podcast. I'm your host, Wes, a psychotherapist helping men mature through timeless wisdom and practical guidance. Today's guest is Zac Phillips. Zac is a young men's facilitator, musician, and storyteller who brings a unique perspective to personal development and masculinity. His work focuses on creative action, youth mentorship, and helping people navigate authentic expression of both their masculine and feminine aspects. Zac, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Wes. Good to be here.
Yes, and thank you for the breathwork exercise we did right before this. For those who obviously weren't there, it's very grounding. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. My pleasure.
You've spoken about how being creative and taking action can be just as confronting and effective as sharing your feelings, and traditional healing, quote unquote, modalities like talk therapy and emotional vulnerability. There's something so powerful about this idea that life itself is a creative process, to use your language, and its connection to spirituality as well. Can you walk us through how you've seen this play out both in your own experience and the work that you do with young men?
Great, multifaceted question. So I'll do my best to stay on top of it here. I mean, really, this idea that we create our own reality and that healing is not just something that happens in a sealed container with a therapist or just something that you do sometimes, every other Tuesday in a men's group, but it's something that we can be present to really at any moment, even just dropping in for a breath work like we did just now, as a way to tap into what is the experience of Zac or Wes. And so my dad was a guitarist, and so I've been playing music since probably like 13. And one of the things I noticed, especially once I began to write my own music, is that in my best creative moments, it didn't actually feel like it was me writing it, but it felt like I was collaborating with something else. Because ideas, it's not like, oh, I would, yes, I would sit down with my guitar or piano or whatever, and I would write it, but it didn't ever really feel like it was entirely mine. Like the idea would just shoot into my brain. I would hear, a melody or something, and then it felt like, okay, this is what I have to work with. That connection to me feels like creative, but also just attached to creator or God or whatever you want to call it. It just feels like it's inseparable from that concept of okay, this idea just comes into my head. Where did it really come from? I don't know. It doesn't feel like it's like my original idea, but I feel like it's kind of a collaboration in terms of, like, what do I do with it now? And there is the authorship part, to me, becomes actually finishing the idea that comes through, because oftentimes there's a separation between that initial inspiration and trying to ride that wave. But then at the end of the day, it's like, is it just going to sit in my catalog of unfinished voice note songs, or is it going to actually become something that I release or put out into the world? And I think that part is equally as important. The other piece is, you mentioned play as well, and the creative process for me, like, I have had a very strong inner critic throughout my life that I've internalized from family stuff and whatnot. And play and creativity really helps the protector parts of me feel like they can kind of lay down their armor for a bit, and helps me really tap into these inner child parts of myself that want to be weirder or be creative or be more expressive.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that. And this concept you speak to about, we could call it the transcendent spirit kind of taking over a creative act. It's really interesting because I feel that happens in therapy sessions. You don't plan any session, you show up. I don't know what someone's going to say. And in that moment and throughout the session, it's this back and forth, almost creating a dialogue and seeing where it's going. I mean, obviously, I'm facilitating that in some sort of structured, guided manner, but other than that, it's fairly dynamic. But I do agree that ironically, even though the session feels like dynamic and integrated and there's this creative act happening, it once the door shuts, then it shuts. It almost it represents, like you were saying, this kind of closed offness. And that's something that I really try to work on in my practice, is saying the way that I'm mirroring the dynamism and the creativity back and forth flow within the session essentially should be done in someone's real life outside of the session. And if the session doesn't help you integrate, I think you'd use that word, into your real life, then you're not wasting time, but it's definitely not as effective. And I'm curious, like, how you see that transcendent creative spirit come out in your work with men, if you've experienced the same in your dialogue and your facilitations, and what that may look like.
Yeah, I mean, I believe that both our definition of what creativity is and our definition of what spirituality is are can be a bit confined to, you know, these specific containers. But to me, it really is about cultivating a practice within yourself. And to me, it's like personal growth related stuff, or whenever we're digging deep and getting to this authentic expression part, like I can't think of a more spiritual thing than cultivating self awareness and cultivating growth, and also cultivating different ways that we see ourselves, because I think that's really an underrated part of the creative process, is just like, who am I? And because that changes, you know, like I have these core memories of ways that maybe I've been hurt or disappointed throughout life, but every time I bring that back into my awareness, bring those memories, there's actually, the way that memory works is that we're actually rewriting the story. So we have the opportunity to rewrite who we are in that story, in the character of our own lives.
Wow, that's fascinating. I didn't know that about memory. And that checks out as well with trauma work. The trauma that people experience tends to create some sort of narrative that then gets projected onto everyday life. And the analogy I use is, imagine that your life is like a movie and there's all these scenes. Well, the trauma is a snapshot within time. But the problem is, after the trauma happens, instead of seeing subsequent scenes play out, you see that same snapshot. So you start to mar reality with a projection. And I imagine this is the same if you stifle creativity, or you think it's confined to some sort of project, or let's say God, to some sort of specific ideology, then you can tend to see the snapshot instead of allowing it to play out. So I appreciate you saying that. And something that came to mind, this concept from Carl Jung. He says, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And I like that a lot. I resonate as well. I play music, and I also do this podcast and write. I know you're a writer. I'm curious if you resonate with this, but I find that same sense of that transcendent spirit where something will just drop into my psyche, my awareness. And I love that you said you have to act on it to manifest it, to see it through. I mean, what we didn't create is the initial origin of it, the genesis that comes to us. But then once it's in our conscience, we are responsible for what we do with it. And it's okay that we let many of the things that drop into our conscience go, because we go crazy trying to follow up on everything that comes into our mind.
Yeah.
And at the same time, what I'm hearing you say is there's this sort of, I don't know if it's a conviction, but some sort of actionized spirit that needs to see the idea through in order to honor the full value of it. That just because you have the idea, you can talk about it. And guilty as charged, how many times have I said, oh, yeah, I have this idea, I'm going to do it. And then I don't do it. And because we live in a culture that rewards people for talking about ideas and not actionizing them, or the opposite, right? I'm sure you have seen there's plenty of people that actionize without the idea, and it like sucks the life out of things. And that's what we would call like hyper productivity and optimization, all these things. And I
Mhm.
find men are in one of those two categories where they tend to like not actionize, and there's certain ideas and visions and things they need to be creative in creating their life vision and follow up on. or they're just so focused on the progress that they forget who they're becoming and that spirit which, led them there to begin with.
Mm. Yeah, totally. I definitely see that. The other piece that I want to mention with all this is just in the age of social media, it becomes easier and easier to just share all of these things, and that is a blessing and also a curse because I feel like it's created this sense of self consciousness in terms of like, okay, like we used to just use social media for like posting photos of stuff that we were doing, like a good meal that we had had or something, and that seems like so far off base to where we've come, that there's this whole self-consciousness around authenticity and personal branding, and it can really be, I feel like, detrimental to the authentic creative process. The other piece where it ties in is with capitalism. It's like we used to just get around the fire and play music with our relatives and our community because we didn't have endless other sources of entertainment. And I feel like that piece, like there's this thing where almost like hobbies should be protected to a certain extent of like, okay, do I really need to share this and put this open to criticism from people, total strangers across the world? Like, not everything that we need, that we feel compelled to work on, needs to be shared immediately. I even noticed this with like so I studied photography the first couple years of going to college, and there was so much focus on criticism and like interpreting what we were doing, where I was like, this effort would, like, yes, I think that has a place, but the effort in my opinion would have been better served in just like more, mess around and find out energy of like, you can't really develop your voice, your authentic voice, if there's a magnifying glass like trying to criticize and analyze every inch of it, because sometimes it doesn't fully make sense until there's been a little bit more experience or other works that have produced where you're able to sort of like come up with a theme or, yeah, this is what this means kind of sense of it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I resonate with all of that. And I'm curious, as an artist and someone who's both trained and does it as a hobby, that inner critic seems to be a common experience of a lot of men I know, that they're very hard on themselves. And again, if you are creating, yes, let's say art, but then a full life, as you're saying, and that's spiritual in and of itself, many men aren't taking those risks and letting it be messy because there's so much shame that comes with, well, what if I fail? Or what does it say about me if it doesn't work out how I thought? Or what are people going to think about me? So I'm curious, how have you learned to quiet that inner critic and learn to be in the mess and process and allow your creativity to have that trial and error time where you're not immediately trying to choke the life out of it by categorizing it or interpreting it, but essentially you're just allowing it to be what it is in the workshopping?
Mm, that's a good question. I mean, I feel like it's still a process, even just with like showing up on social media and being seen and trying to be real rather than this performance of myself. Like, I think it comes down to this parts work aspect again of like, how do I tell these parts of myself that are scared or that are, afraid of being ridiculed or canceled or whatever? Like, how do I uh, meet those parts and be like, you know what, I get we've had these experiences in the past where maybe we've been hurt for speaking up or shamed for speaking up or for being weird or different. And it's also like recognizing that those defense mechanisms are not going to yield the results that 39-year-old Zach wants to achieve in his life, and that there's a risk in putting stuff out there, because yes, like, I can't guarantee that you won't face criticism or ridicule, especially from random strangers online. But to me, it's a way of honoring that part of myself, well, different parts of myself, because I think with the protector, One strategy that I've actually found really helpful is to say, instead of being like, oh, you're not needed, like, thank you for protecting me. This part of myself that has caused a lot of resistance and sort of shrinking away from that authentic expression piece has been in service to protecting myself and telling that part of myself, thank you for protecting me. And your job isn't really needed in the same way that it was when I was 12. It's like that is a really powerful way to rewrite the narrative. The other aspect is just working with young men. Like, a lot of my personal wounding comes around the teenager years of, like, I had this did this alternative schooling homeschool cooperative thing, and around 12 I transferred to this really intense, like, elite prep school. And it was just a complete culture shock, and realizing, oh man, there's all of these social rules and ways that I'm supposed to be that did not resonate with where I was coming from. And so being able to work with these young men who are the same age. So, just to explain a little bit, I work with men usually around like 11 to 19 in these online group containers with this organization, Rooted Futures. And that in and of itself has been really, really hard at times, because it has brought up some of these projections of being this weird and sometimes awkward and uncomfortable youth, and brought up these memories of being ridiculed. And it's also been really healing, because again, I'm able to bring the awareness of adult Zach back to these parts of myself and realize, oh, I'm projecting onto these young men, and how do I bring this back to myself and realize what I'm doing now with the tools that I have of self-soothing and self-acceptance within the parts of myself.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. It's so powerful that a lot of your purpose and work that you're doing is tied to your own wounding, which I resonate with. It's a big reason why I'm doing this podcast. I lost my dad when I was 11, and I feel like I didn't have that meaning and guidance, and was going through that awkward middle school time. And I even remember moving halfway across the country. And, when you start a new school and you meet kids, one of the first things they ask is, well, why'd you move here? And I didn't think saying my dad died was a good way to start. Bit of a buzzkill in middle school. So you internalize that and you realize, oh gosh, like no one wants to talk to me. I don't know how to talk. There's something wrong with me. Kind of what you're getting at. When you're in those environments and there's not a lot of affirmation or safety or guidance. So I agree with that. And within that work, it tends to reinvigorate our wounds in a way that is painful. And it's like, gosh, I thought I was done with this. So, I thought I'd already worked through this. And here we are again, and I'm triggered, or this is coming up. But like you're getting at, it's an actual gift, as hard as it is, because it's a continual refinement and authentication of who you are that allows you to deal with it. And normalizing that with the kids, that stuff comes up for you, that you don't have it all together. I think that's really important.
Mm.
And speaking of norms, you've talked about how there's the masculine and the feminine within each person. And there's this fascinating idea that men actually become more manly through also becoming feminine, which upon first hearing may sound paradoxical. But in a world where social media, as we've been talking about, is constantly defining what masculinity looks like, and I would say both extremes, right? And men are wondering, well, what's the truth and where do I look? How do we find that authentic balance within ourselves, and what does that exploration look like practically?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think that it is an ongoing practice. It's something to me where we focus men's work. I was really deep into men's work for the past 4 years, and I noticed this pattern of kind of just very black and white belief system when it came to polarity, that like as men we're just supposed to inhabit this like strength and presence. And but I also noticed that a lot of men have a lot of wounding around self-expression and real confusion around like what is safe for me to actually share about myself, and that just reinforces these wounds around self-expression, which are actually, you know, would be part of the feminine polarity. So I think that really in a lot of men's groups, it's a very basic understanding of polarity, and that part of the of achieving wholeness is really stepping into both sides of ourselves and appreciating both sides of ourselves and realizing that yeah, different men are going to be authentically expressed in different ways. Are more this like strong masculine, you know, archetype, and some will be have these, you know, funny, creative, expressive sides. And so I think part of it is it doesn't have to be a static thing. It can be, okay, how do I show up fully in this moment? Sometimes I feel like we get ourselves in the weeds a little bit by focusing too much on like, okay, well, I need to be more masculine in this moment rather than just being present with what is needed in the actual moment. Because just looking at romantic relationships, you know, with my fiance, like going into intimacy and being just like totally masculine and like boundaries and closed off can actually feel super unsafe to women in general. And both to be able to hold both like a softening and an opening of the heart and this strong solid sense of presence, like to me that is the goal in terms of being able to really express both in a single moment even.
Yeah, I'm glad you named that temptation to box ourselves in, and the wounding of men trying to express themselves. Partially, I think because in general in society, we haven't quite hit our mark on how to support men in self expression. I think there's a lot of like, this is how you should or shouldn't express yourself.
Yeah.
Um, and like you said, men feel closed off, but, you know, you're getting at a really powerful point, which is to be an integrated person, you really can't try to suppress a part of you that's real. It kind of goes again to Carl Jung, his concept of the anima and animus, that those two male, female spirits and energy live within each of us. And like you said, some traits are more manifest than others, and there's certainly a range within, you know, the biology of what you're given at birth, but that range is dynamic and unique to each person. And to help a man accept those parts, as you were saying, just as valid and necessary, while at the same time not fitting into what we would call masculine. It's more important essentially just to name it and claim it, you know, and live into that than it is to try to analyze it or suppress it or say, well, it's not going to be accepted or what's the point of this? And your ability to do that really does make a positive impact on others, like you're mentioning with your fiance. And something that struck me as you were saying too, that whole like, there's the more stoic, like strength kind of based and more masculine normative historically on what we would see as a man. And then there's this more like creative, playful expression. As you were talking, I said, yeah, like I can see both in me. You know, there's so many times where I am goofy and playful and I express myself. And even in my marriage, I'm the one that tends to take things more personally and to
Yeah.
tap into the emotional current of what's going on between us. And my wife's a lot more rational and like matter of fact and can kind of point out the different fallacies or truth in a situation. And at the same time, you know, I love pushing myself physically. I do these long races and I just find myself wanting to own the moment. And I thank you for naming that. It just helped me feel more at peace to say, great, this is an example of, instead of saying, well, this is in, this is out, just saying, oh, this is me. And how can I integrate that all? And I think for any
Yeah.
guy listening, you got to find those traits within yourself and name them and not be so quick to suppress them or ignore them or try to box them in.
Well, the other place where I really see this showing up, and this is definitely from speaking from personal experience, is like going into men's work, there's all of this self improvement stuff that we can do. And that can become this total wormhole that we go through. And in my opinion, it can actually be there, for me at least, it really helped to cultivate a sense of self acceptance first. So a foundation of self acceptance, which I see as being more a feminine trait of like just loving and accepting the self, and then building the self improvement stuff on top of that. Because I found myself just like kind of almost forming an addiction to, oh, I've got to like learn a new framework or do more push-ups, or it's this more thing, when like in actuality I needed to do some more healing work around just being okay with myself, how I was, no improvement needed. So there is this paradox of like, oh yeah, okay, I'm not exactly loving, my experience of my life in this moment, but that meeting yourself where you're at and then building on top of that, I feel like is really important.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also resonate with that. If I look back to all the low points in my life, let's say, they all are correlated with me pushing towards something instead of surrendering to something in the present. And the unresolved trauma or pain, or even just a lack of self awareness, and thinking that it's more important to accomplish. But I love that framework of the self acceptance as the foundation, the core, the essence. You have to start with it. Now, the question is, do I accept everything that is in the foundation? And that's where the work comes to say, well, if it's not helpful, if it's not healing, then sure, I can learn to refine that in a way where it would be more appropriate to accept it. But many times there's way more that needs to be accepted, that's already enough, that needs to be cherished and loved, that many men just overlook because they think, well, I got to do more and more. And I agree, it just gets exhausting. It internalizes the shame, I'm not enough because I have to do more. And if I don't do a certain amount and produce this certain outcome, then what does that say about me as a person? And I think it's a radical act of love to gently put that aside and really just check in and have those exercises that hold both intention, because at the same time, we can feel stuck and plateaued if all we do is accept. I mean, this is a thing I find common in therapy, men and women who come to me who have worked with a therapist, and I said, I'm just curious why, it didn't work out. And 9 out of 10 times, in some sort of form or fashion, they say, well, they heard me out, they accepted me, but I didn't know what to do next. What do I do now that I've accepted it? And I think there is this healthy, like, calling forth, calling out. But I totally agree. It's got to start with the anchor foundation of knowing who you are. And this is what you're getting at. It's the nurturing and the loving of the eternal mother, that says, I love you. You're enough. I'm going to cherish what is. And then that kind of challenge calling forth, that the paternal tends to do. And if you don't have both, and certainly starting from the nurture, I mean, this is why the mother is the primary caregiver, as having a kid for the first, couple years, really, because you need to establish that nurturing acceptance foundation before there is any sort of calling forth or growing.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And really, that balance, it looks like different things for different people at different stages. And so it's like, this is something I'm often thinking about with my daughter and in the youth mentorship stuff, because so these young men are coming from a lot of situations where they're maybe in school and there's more of a like behavior policing kind of energy around just existing in a classroom, or sports, and so everything is very structured. And so I feel like it's really important to create these spaces that feel safe for this authentic expression piece. And then also, at what point do some people just need more challenge? And like you were saying with the therapist, like I've had experiences myself in therapy where I'm like, okay, this is feeling good, but also I feel like I'm just coming here and kind of narrating the story of what happened to me, rather than like, what are you going to do about it, or what are some tools that I can do to, kind of unstick myself from the current problems that I'm having. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for naming that. I think that's true. I've had other guests, we've talked about this. There's so much research around how school is set up very poorly for boys, and everything is sit down, be quiet, and stay within the boxes. And you need to let, especially a boy, roam wild and free. Circling back to your point about the creative act, it is messy and they have to get their hands dirty literally and mentally to explore and to extract meaning out of things. You mentioned your daughter. You have the unique experience of having a trans daughter, which I imagine has given you insights into identity and authenticity and what sexuality and gender expression may look like for the next generation. So I'm curious how that personal journey has shaped your understanding of authentic expression as a person and the work you do with young people.
Yeah, great question. Just to tie this together with actually this school, kind of like the needs of young boys too. So until a couple of years ago, I knew my daughter as a boy, and she had some developmental difficulties around age 5 that were extremely helped by play therapy and by big body play. So she was having a really hard time focusing and doing fine motor skills related things and emotional regulation. And there's a scaffolding that needs to happen that I wish more educators and like school policy writers would know about. But it's like really that foundational piece of having more big body movement, big body play. Like, this is why boys do so well with like roughhousing, and that kind of stuff can actually lead to the capacity to focus in a more intentional kind of way. But it's like a developmental need. And so this is part of my frustration just with the system in general, is that recess, music, like these are the things that are first kind of just like, oh, that's not that important. But to me, it's a key part of building the scaffolding of developing into a well-rounded human. But in terms of my own experience with my daughter, yeah, it's definitely turned me on my head in some ways of just my understanding of gender and polarity. And she's always had aspects that are very like feminine, and so it's like I can't say it was a huge surprise when she came out, but that process, yeah, it was definitely difficult. So I was like in the process of really healing my masculine side, going into all this men's work stuff. My father passed away in 2020, and that made me realize just like how disconnected I was from the masculine parts of myself. And so I was in this process of really just like honing in on what it means to be a man and all of these different things. And in the context of that, it felt really jarring at times. And I think as a parent, it's our job to really facilitate the unique development of this soul, which feels like it transcends any sort of like shoulds or frameworks, and coming at her with a sense of love and self acceptance first. And also just talking to her more about it. Like, it's been a very healing process as well. Just to be frank, like last year, she was really having a hard time, and therapy and art therapy really helped her come more into herself. But I would say it really, the politicization of it really makes it difficult, because there's all of these people who really don't have any personal experience with it on either side, espousing all of these ideologies. And I think really, even like joining support groups on Facebook and that kind of thing, it was very like, you better support this or else. And I don't really want to hear any of your personal feelings. Because to me, I went through my own grieving process around, okay, this was, I thought my son, and now she's my daughter. And just, kind of grieving these notions of who I thought she was going to become. And then also realizing, oh yeah, it's my job to facilitate her into her individuality, not to get too attached to any ideas about how I think that that should develop in the first place. So yeah, now it's like we still are able to do a lot of things that we did before, in terms of like, she loves spending time in nature, she and I both love cooking and sharing food. And so like, I feel like our relationship has changed a lot even in the past year, as she's developing a more comfortability and more exploration in terms of like being herself. And it manifests itself in some really funny and endearing ways, where she's like super into learning about her Czech ancestry. And so she's been like learning Czech and making all of these wild, like Eastern European dishes and sharing them with me. And so I think it's like, it's helped to, because honestly, from the men's work community, even, I've had a lot of unsolicited advice around like, oh, this is how polarity is, and it's like going against the natural way of things. And I'm like, that's really where we were at with homosexuality, like not too long ago. And so to me, it feels like nature, colors, music, it's all on a spectrum. So it's like being able to see the nuance and if we're talking about polarity, look at the yin yang symbol. It's a dynamic system where there's a little speck of the masculine in this column of femininity, and the same is true with the feminine part in the masculine, and that's a dynamic shifting system that manifests itself differently in different people. So to me, it's been actually really healing, having these wounds around feeling different and feeling more feminine, as a young man, to come and meet her where she's at and support her in the way that she wants to be seen and developed.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing all that. Obviously, very personal and very much in process. And I think what I was hearing in that that really struck me is your dad passing, you having this reinvigoration of needing to explore your masculine side, which happened to me as well when you were saying that. I remember doing the same and going through some self initiated rites of passage and just tapping into that in an interesting way that almost grieved not having it through him anymore, but living it out in spirit as he would continue on in a sense. But then for you to have that, and then for you to have the experience with your daughter, which reinvigorated the feminine, but in a redemptive manner, to where as a kid you had a more negative experience transitioning schools and having to change the way you express that. And then now for her to have space held by you to champion that and to explore it. And then the last piece that really struck me, and I've never really thought about this, is, what your experience of grieving your kid not being who you thought they were, I think is a universally shared parent experience.
Yeah.
In most cases it's not sexuality, but it's still going to college, right? Marrying this type of person, moving to this type of place, believing these kind of ideologies. I think I was just thinking through, wow, yeah, what a beautiful example of realizing, even down to our sexuality and gender, we cannot hold on to these expectations. Now it's totally understandable, because what else could you do? You have to live in some sort of expectation, and understandably, you did that within reason. But I think that word you mentioned, grief, and for any parents out there listening, that's, I think, a lesson to take away, is to say, where is your child like changing and evolving in a way that was unexpected or unpredictable, that you have yet to come to terms with, that you really just can't let go of. And through Zach, you sharing, I think it's helpful for parents to know that's not a nice to have, like that's essential, because what you're missing is who your kid actually is as you're holding on to the expectation of who they should be. And those are years that you can't get back. And it seems like you have been present and aware and surrendering to that, and it's shown up in ways that have been healing for you and allow you to bond with your kid in ways you never thought before were possible.
Yeah, totally. And the other piece, and this ties back to my youth mentorship stuff, is that there's a developmental imperative for differentiation from the family unit. And then all of a sudden, for me, it was like all of a sudden my daughter was like, okay, the way that you guys do things are all of a sudden stupid. And I'm going to find my way of doing things that are different. And I feel like that's a very normal process of, the developmental stage that she's coming into now is all about finding her core values that may be different than mine. And part of that too has to do with mentorship in terms of like seeking influences outside of the parental unit that she can be inspired by, and try on these different masks and sort of see what resonates with her core identity, and then dumping the rest and then trying on another mask. And so I feel like this is where the youth mentorship work also comes in terms of like we are meant to be in a community and not just have these two role models that we've had throughout childhood, but to experience many different archetypes of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and to have these other mentoring relationships. And I was lucky to have like a friend's dad back when I was her age, like who would take us on road trips or teach me guitar stuff and like learn about Native American culture and all these different things. And that was really affirming because I was able to take things that I enjoyed about this other relationship and integrate it into, okay, this is how I want to show up as an adult myself. The youth mentorship stuff, I feel like, and having these other influences are especially important as young people, and in my case, the young men are in this process of rejecting aspects about their parents and trying to find something different. So I think having this community aspect where you're able to experience um, like sharing and just what's going on with many different adults can be a really healthy way of being able to explore which archetypes resonate with the teenager's core identity. And the beautiful thing is like it really doesn't take a lot. It's just by through this process of creating a safe space where we're all sharing what we're going through. It's like different people are gonna represent different archetypes and different energies. And so it can become a really healthy thing, I think, to have this variety of different influences, because in the vacuum of having that, it's like there's social media, like Andrew Tate, for example, like they will find these other role models, and it just seems like much more healthy to have a more balanced and open sense of like and real sense of like who these community members are.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. The research tells us that the best outcome for a child is for them to know absolutely who their two primary caregivers are, the ones that when all else fails, like these two people will be here for me and love me and support me, in combination with exactly what you're saying, which is a variety of alternative caregivers, which are secondary, which essentially the child knows, okay, this isn't the main person that's taking care of me, but they are caring for me in a certain way. And they're teaching me what it means to be cared for and to care in a way that my parents can't. And, you're speaking at so many different dynamics that have created this crisis. People, especially young families, let's say, are moving away from their village where they grew up, and it's just them. They don't have grandparents around, they don't have a lot of friends. And then, yeah, the kid may go to daycare, but essentially that kid is not having many touch points with other adults that are showing them these varieties ways of living. And I have this kind of disparate experience of my family dynamic. After my dad passed, we moved halfway across the country. My mom got remarried. I have step siblings. But then right after college, we all moved different places in the South. and you feel that dissonance that I'm not as close. Meanwhile, I met my wife, who's Italian American. She's from Boston, and I joke that everyone in her family has an ankle bracelet that goes off if you go more than 5 miles outside of the house, because it's just so cohesive and put together. I've come to appreciate, like, my son is watched by my mother-in-law on Fridays and then gets time with, aunts and uncles and cousins. Is just, and then along with that, our community that is full of other fathers and mothers. So I think that's right. I appreciate you sharing that, even from your childhood, of how much that meant to have another guy there to show you something different that your dad couldn't. And on the note of youth mentorship, you have emphasized letting go of having this perfect technique. We've talked a lot about that inner critic and expectations and those things. And instead, you suggest that being attuned and aware is the approach that works best. You've also talked about how the spirit of play combats that criticism and unlocks, let's say, a relaxation and rest in being yourself. So I'm curious, how do you help young men understand that being a mature man is about being in service to others rather than focusing on the return on investment of everything serving yourself and being about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a polarity between play and performance, and there again comes back to this masculine feminine dynamic as well, but that we actually have in Rooted Futures, the organization I'm working with, we have very specific parameters on what a mentor is and what a mentor isn't. And so it's listen, ask questions, affirm, praise. Those are the do's. And then the don'ts are fix, rescue, advice, and projection. So those are the things that we try to stay away from as much as possible to nurture this young man's development. And I think just providing a space where young men are able to show up and have these modeling ways of being, showing some realness and at times vulnerability. I think that that can go a long way to creating a space that's like healing and healthy for everyone. Because there is back to my own experience, there is this sense of just piling on frameworks and getting obsessed with sort of like, okay, this person that seems really impressive, this coach is like telling me that this is how things are. And so I'm going to superimpose their values onto my life. To me, there's a much more rich relationship that can form around just questioning that and being curious. Like this last in-person event that we were in, we had some really interesting discussions about some slang words that were being used, and coming to it not from a like, oh, this is being disrespectful to women, kind of thing, and like, what does this mean to you, and picking this apart, because in actuality, these young men are like have a deeper understanding of what their language means than and what their experience means than I do. And so I think this process of really showing up as a mentor and trying to empower other people to have their own to articulate their own experiences is more valuable to me than any sort of like, you should follow this way of doing things, any super imposition of my values could be. Because my values are going to come through naturally through the way that I share what I'm talking about, just like how I live my life. And so there's no real need for, saying, well, clearly the way to do things is this way. And in fact, I think all unsolicited advice is projection. It's advice that's better served for you pointing it back to your previous self than to project it onto these young people who are just trying to figure out who they are.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I'm just like laughing in my head because it's such a stereotypical male thing to give unsolicited advice, especially the older generation. And in my work as a therapist, that is one of the unofficial ethical guidelines and vows you're essentially taking, which is it's not about you and what you know. The point is that the client is coming to understand themselves better. And at best, the projection, makes you feel good and temporarily makes the other person feel like you're being helpful. At worst, it appears to be helpful at first, and then ultimately it leaves someone worse off because they're further away from understanding what they want and what they need, and they're either attaching or focusing on what you think is best. And I like what you said. These boys in this conversation about the slang are the experts of their own lives. They are the ones that know themselves best. And the powerful thing about not projecting is that either one of two things happen. Either the person realizes, I don't know the answer and I got more work to do. I need to be more self aware. I need to deepen my skills of reflecting to get a sense of the meaning behind something, because just not knowing isn't going to fly. But the other option that happens is someone realizes some self awareness in the work that they have done, they tap into it, and they feel empowered to act on it. But either way, it's not you enabling or doing the work for them, whether it's the getting the self awareness to begin with or acting on it. And it takes a lot of radical trust. I don't know about you in these situations, but there's so many times I think I know the answer and you want to shake someone, and here's what it is, here's your get out of jail free card. And ultimately I just have to take a deep breath and just say, okay, that's the ego trying to, like you said, in that framework, rescue them.
Mhm.
And I appreciate you using those guidelines. It's something I'm certainly going to use as someone that, works with other people and try not to give advice and who plays a mentor role. And I'm curious, just on a personal level, of those don'ts, do you find yourself struggling with one more than the other?
I feel like I feel like, first of all, that they're all related.
Yeah,
They're
I
all
agree.
related, and so a lot of times projection can show up in trying to fix somebody. I'd say, fix or rescue are also pretty similar. So I do feel like, as I've worked with this organization and also as I've developed as a coach, like when I first got my coaching certification, and like in the training of that, the practice sessions for that, it was all about like, okay, I'm going to come in with my newly found knowledge and like provide the perfect framework for healing. And just as I've grown and matured and just learned more about psychology, I've come to really value like Carl Rogers' approach of like the ability to listen and the relationship with the client are the two most important aspects, and that provides a foundation for growth to happen. And so really, um it's like in those moments when I was wanting to prove myself with all these frameworks, it became more about me and my self-confidence and proving to myself than it became about the person that supposedly I was trying to help in the first place. So I think, as people who have, a upper hand in terms of like the power dynamic of the relationship, it's really important to be aware of how we're wielding that. Because in my mind, it should be about empowering the person that you're serving rather than empowering myself to like put another medal on my, you know, like on my neck around how great of a coach I am.
Yeah, I love that analogy. And I love Carl Rogers, all the Carls today, Jung, Rogers. It's good. Yeah, and I love that you named those two traits that most mark success. And I'll add another framework he talks about of unconditional positive regard, and that is that no matter how terrible or dark or wrong, quote unquote, the client comes across and shares, the therapist's job is to maintain the integrity of their good nature and to interact with them out of the belief that that's who they are primarily. And that's what establishes a non-judgmental stance, because essentially you're saying, yes, you have problems, but you're not a problem. And my ability to hold acceptance and love and appreciation for who you are as a person, regardless of what you says, makes someone feel safe enough to not be okay and to share those things. Now, that doesn't mean you're partnering or agreeing with those less than ideal sides, because that's the very reason why they're sharing them, because they themselves don't want to live out of that untrue part of them. But going back to the acceptance, self acceptance foundation, we have to at least start there. And you mentioned earlier, these boys are turning to, people like Andrew Tate, and I've heard it said the sin of certainty, that's what they're selling is this is just, you do this, you follow this framework, exactly what you're getting at, and this is the results you'll get. And anything less is a failure or you're weak because you're questioning. And in fact, when you dive into the minutia of what it really means to mature and grow, it is more nuanced, it's complex, it's holding the questions in tension, it's allowing people to reflect and fail and try and get up and try to make sense of things, more than it is this just like straight untouched trajectory of certainty that will certainly lead you to ultimately downfalling, because psychologically you're essentially bypassing the ego. There's no questioning, there's no confronting that core, mask or persona that you mentioned earlier. And you're just living out of the lack of self-awareness of what is true. And I think that's a beautiful place to end, of just realizing to be a man is to know who you are, the masculine, the feminine sides, to tap into that, to appreciate it, to trust yourself, and to go on that journey of playing both physically, but also internally, playing with your life and taking risk. And I just appreciate you sharing all your wisdom today on all the topics we've covered.
Yeah, that's a great summation, and thanks for having me, Wes.
Absolutely. And before we let you go, where can people find you?
I'm primarily on Instagram now at I am Zac Phillips, ZACPHILLIPS. And you can also find out more about this organization I'm working with. It's rootedfutures.org.
Okay, great. We'll make sure to put that in the show notes. And guys, until next time.